Welcome to an episode of Behind the Scenes, a weekly program unveiling the biggest political developments in Somali politics. I'm Sultan Mohammed, your host and co-producer here on Wararka Media alongside Suleiman Hashi. On this week's program, the Somali Prime Minister Mohamed Hussein Roble meets with the EU Ambassador to Somalia, Tina Intelman, in Mogadishu this week as the EU provides $41 million for drought relief. Interestingly, another topic raised with the EU was the request that Somalia condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine. With Somalia's current political and economic predicament, is it in its best interest to pick sides in a wider Russian-NATO conflict? This is the topic on the program today. We hope you find this program very informative. Please like, share, and for similar content, do subscribe to Wararka Media. Also, do subscribe to Wararka Media's second channel known as Wararka TV, where you can find exclusive programs such as Mahahi Saleh, among others. Last but not least, do follow myself, Sultan Mohammed, Suleiman Hashi, Engineer Yasin, and the wider Wararka Media team on our social media platforms that should appear on the screen any moment now. Let's get straight into it. As Europe plunges into war with tensions between Russia and NATO reaching another boiling point, Russia invaded Ukraine last week, which has led to wide-scale international condemnation, particularly from the US, the EU, the UK, Japan, and other Western nations. Interestingly, the EU ambassador to Somalia met with Somali Prime Minister Mohamed Hussein Roble in Mogadishu on Sunday, in which Ambassador Intelman outlined the EU is seeking Somalia's support in condemning the Russia-Ukrainian conflict that's going on in Eastern Europe. Indeed, every war is bad, especially when there is a loss of civilian lives and properties, whether it's in Europe, Asia, or Africa. The war in Eastern Europe, however, is much greater than the simple idea of Russia being a superpower invading a weaker nation known as Ukraine because it can do so. That is a simplistic and quite misleading narrative to push. You see, the political tensions between Russia and NATO has been ongoing for decades. However, it is most relevant following the collapse of the Soviet Union in the Eastern Bloc in 1991. The historic purpose of NATO was to counter the military and political influence of the USSR and the USSR-led Eastern Bloc in Eastern Europe. But once the adversary known as communism ceased to exist by 1991, the newly formed Russia would establish a new chapter between itself and NATO that wouldn't last very, very long. In 1990, Germany reunified with Eastern and Western Germany becoming a new federal republic under which it would be a member of NATO. Now, while no legal or political agreement was ever signed in writing, the then US Secretary of State James Baker told the Soviet leader Gorbachev that there would be no extension of NATO's jurisdiction and there would be not an inch of an expansion to the east. Similarly, assurances were made by Germany, France, and Britain. In 1997, the NATO General Secretary Solana and the Russian Foreign Minister Primakov announced a new agreement that would be known as the Founding Act of Mutual Relations, Cooperation and Security between NATO and the Russian Federation. Under this agreement, NATO assured a concerned Russia that the military alliance had, and I quote, no plans to station any nuclear weapons in any new member state or, and I quote, send any new permanent military force there. However, ever since then, NATO has only continued to expand eastwards until it has finally reached the Russian border via Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Currently, NATO recognizes 3 countries as aspiring members: Bosnia, Georgia, and Ukraine. This continued incorporation of former Soviet and Eastern Bloc nations into NATO that are so close to the Russian border has been a major reason for Russian concern and its current aggressive actions that we see in Ukraine. Let's take a look at the aforementioned nations that I talked about to kind of see case study by case study of how Russia is countering or attempted to counter NATO expansion. Now, if we look at Bosnia Herzegovina, we see tensions rise as of late, with ethnic Serbian Republika Srpska voting to leave key institutions in what some call a secessionist move in December 2021. This would and could possibly dismantle the Dayton Agreement signed in 1995 that brought peace to Bosnia via a power-sharing model. There are reports that the Srpska Prime Minister Radonov Voskovic has close relations to Russia, with Serbian paramilitary groups fighting alongside Russians in eastern Ukraine, and many Serbian paramilitary groups were seen in Crimea during the Russian annexation of the region in 2014. Now, if we look more towards Central Asia, if we look at Georgia, there was the Russian invasion in 2008, following the actual possibility of Georgia joining NATO, and this resulted in a de facto permanent establishment of South Ossetia, which saw Georgia carved in de facto two separate governments. The separatist regime still receives political and military support from Russia. Similarly, we see in Ukraine the propping up of separatist regimes in Lugansk and Donetsk, which has resulted in direct actions of Russia supporting these regional separatist regimes due to Russian fears of the possibility of NATO expanding into Ukraine. See, the point I'm trying to make here is that in all three cases, we see NATO having some kind of vested interest in those nations and trying to either support or encourage a NATO backing government there. And what we can see is Russia identifying these particular countries, particularly the ones that border its south, and trying to then attempt to dismantle the work being done by NATO or that government that supports NATO. The reality is that this NATO-Russia Cold War has been going on for decades now, and while each nation, whether it's Georgia, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Bosnia, has a right to join NATO freely, it must be done freely and not through political and military means. I understand the worry, for example, facing the Baltic states, as Russia has previously invaded those countries way back in 1941 and incorporated them as part of the Soviet Union for 50 years until 1990. They probably see the Russian invasions of Georgia and Ukraine and express concern, and rightfully so. However, countries like Ukraine are divided nations, and while the east of Ukraine aligned more with Russia, the west aligned more with the European Union. This ethnic divide between Russian and Ukrainian speakers in Ukraine has been the crux of Ukraine's problem as it looks for a new identity 30 years after it left the Soviet Union. It seems as though Ukraine is still deciding its destiny, and it's been unfortunately caught in the middle of two warring global powers. The reality for Somalia, however, is that Somalia does not need any more global enemies on the international stage. Of course, Somalia ought to condemn the senseless loss of civilian lives and property and provide whatever it can to the people, the innocent civilians of Ukraine. However, Somalia cannot take sides in a conflict that it has nothing to do with. By condemning Russia, Somalia has sided with NATO, and by sympathizing with Russia's security concerns, it could be an indication that Somalia has sided with Moscow. For Somalia, it must take strategically thought through steps. The biggest hindrance to Somalia today is removing its UN arms embargo imposed more than 30 years ago, as the opposition is mainly from Western countries. Now, Somalia could strategically benefit theoretically by pushing for EU support for Somali army and the removal of the arms embargo. However, we must think about Russia, who's also a permanent member of the UN Security Council and could veto any possible actions in a situation where Russia considers Somalia betraying it and supporting a NATO expansion against Russian national interests. In conclusion, Somalia must stay neutral. As the world continues to fracture into East and West yet again, Somalia must reap the benefits from both sides as it develops to stand on its own 2 feet. Somalia cannot afford global enemies at this time. I would also like to mention the excellent work done by the Somali Foreign Ministry led by Abdulsaeed Ali and the Somali embassies in Berlin, Brussels and Belgrade, and have tirelessly and around-the-clock worked to ensure the successful evacuation of thousands of ethnic Somalis from conflict in Ukraine. Thousands of African students have been stranded in Ukraine, and Somalia is one of the few African nations that have successfully evacuated hundreds of its citizens. The past few weeks, I'm sure many of the viewers have seen the Somali Foreign Minister in back-to-back calls and meetings with various world leaders and governments. Now, what does this mean? What it makes clear is that the Somali nation is definitely emerging from the rubbles of war and reviving itself as the world keeps a close eye and a keen interest in the former regional power known as Somalia. As chaos engulfs international relations, Somalia must keep its cards very close to her sleeves as the nation navigates through the anarchical and treacherous world of international relations.